In our last conversation, we uncovered the lie that retirement is freedom, that your life belongs to you after the system is done with you. But once you see that illusion for what it is, once you realize the promised land was just another stage, an even harder question appears. How much is enough? Because the moment you stop believing in the story, you're left staring at the math, the number, the so-called target everyone says you need to hit before you can finally rest. You're told to find your magic figure, $1 million, $2 million more, and maybe you've already started chasing it. But Alan Watts would pause and ask, what if you don't need money to be free? What if you just need the courage to live without a script? Because that's what this really is, a script, one that tells you your right to live must be earned, that peace comes after, that aliveness is conditional. And so you chase the number not because you love money, but because you're afraid of what happens without it. But here's the truth. The problem isn't how much you have. The problem is what you think you need it for. Most people don't want wealth. They want safety. They want permission. Permission to stop performing, to stop optimizing, to stop pretending they're okay living like this. You think you're chasing freedom, but what you're really chasing is relief. And maybe the only thing standing between you and the life you long for is the belief that you need more before you're allowed to live it. You see, the lie was never just about retirement. It was about what retirement represented, a finish line, a someday. The day when everything would finally make sense. The day when you'd be allowed to rest, to breathe, to feel joy without guilt. For decades, you were sold the fantasy that life is a journey with a destination. That if you worked hard enough, sacrificed long enough, and followed the plan carefully enough, you would eventually arrive. And when you did, then you'd live. But Alan Watts shattered that idea. Life is not a journey with a destination. The purpose of life is to be alive. Not someday, not later, not after your net worth hits a certain milestone. Now, the problem is your brain has been trained to live in not yet. From childhood, you were told to study hard so that you could get into a good school. Get into a good school so that you could get a good job. Get a good job so that you could save money. Save money so that you could retire. And retire so that finally you could be happy. But here's the trap. Someday never comes. Because the habit of postponing life becomes a way of being. It becomes your default operating system, and by the time you're ready to live, you've forgotten how. Behavioral economists call this delay discounting, the tendency to undervalue the present in favor of an imagined future. The longer you train your brain to defer joy, the harder it becomes to recognize joy when it's right in front of you. You don't just delay life. You lose the ability to feel alive at all. That's why millions of people stay in jobs they quietly hate. According to Gallup's 2023 report, 61% of Americans are emotionally detached from their work. But they keep showing up, not because they believe in what they do, but because they're terrified of what happens if they stop. You're not working for freedom. You're working to maintain momentum, to keep moving. Because if you stop, you'll have to face the silence. And in that silence, you might have to admit that you never wanted this life in the first place. This is the danger of the retirement myth. It gives you something to chase, but never something to feel. It teaches you to run, but not how to arrive. It turns existence into a transaction. Trade your time now to buy your life later. But Watts reminds us, you can't buy aliveness. You can't earn it through suffering. You can't stockpile it like a savings account. Life is happening whether you're present for it or not. And the longer you tell yourself, I'll enjoy it later, the more later becomes a ghost you're chasing in circles. So ask yourself, what are you really running toward? And more importantly, what are you running from? Because until you stop chasing the fantasy of one day, you'll keep postponing the only thing that's ever been real, this moment. The breath you're taking right now, the quiet truth inside you that's been waiting to be heard. You don't need to arrive at retirement to start living. You need to wake up from the trance that told you life begins when the work is over. Because if you keep living like this, retirement won't be freedom, it'll be grief. The grief of realizing you spent your best years preparing for a life that never arrived. So if retirement isn't the destination, if someday never really arrives, then what now? Here's where the illusion gets even deeper. Because when you finally begin to question the finish line, the world offers you a different kind of comfort: money. Not the fantasy of retirement, but the fantasy of financial freedom, passive income, investment portfolios, real estate cash flow. They call it security, but what they're really selling is control. You're told that freedom is a number, that if you just hit it, if your dividends, your savings, your net worth cross the right threshold, you'll finally be safe enough to relax, to be present, to live. But Alan Watts warned us, to hold your breath is to lose your breath. And that's what most people are doing, holding their breath until the money feels like enough. But here's the tragedy. Many people do reach the number and still don't know how to live. Millionaires retire only to fall into anxiety, burnout, even depression, not because they ran out of resources, but because they never practiced presence. They spent decades training their minds to optimize, to maximize, to hustle. And when the machine finally stops, they don't know how to exist outside of it. They have everything they thought they needed and still feel trapped, because freedom was never a product, it was a practice, a way of being they never learned. In 2010, Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman revealed something profound. Beyond a certain income, around $90,000 a year, people's emotional well-being doesn't improve. More money may buy more comfort, but not more happiness. Because happiness isn't built on wealth, it's built on attention, on your capacity to be where you are, not constantly craving where you're not. And that's what so few people realize. You don't buy your way into freedom, you train for it. You live it moment by moment, choice by choice. Not in some imagined future when everything's finally settled, but right here, inside the life you already have. The people who understand this live differently, they stop waiting for permission. They stop optimizing every minute. And instead, they create space in their day for what Watts might call mini retirements. Moments where nothing needs to be earned, achieved, or justified. Moments that aren't useful, but are alive. A walk with no destination. A conversation with no agenda. Silence without guilt. Stillness without shame. These are not luxuries, they are practice. And the more you practice presence, the less afraid you become of your own life. But that's the paradox. The world will keep telling you to chase, that you haven't earned rest yet, that stillness is irresponsible, that time is only valuable if it's producing something. But the people who never slow down never learn how to stop. And the people who never stop never discover who they are beneath the motion. So the question isn't, do you have enough money to be free? The real question is, have you practiced being free at all? Because if you haven't, if you've spent your life holding your breath for the future, you'll get there gasping. And freedom, true freedom, will feel like a foreign language. Not because it's impossible, but because you never gave yourself the silence to learn it. So if freedom isn't something you earn, and if it's not something you buy, then why does it feel so far away? Because from the moment you were old enough to understand words, you were trained not to live, but to prepare, not to be, but to become. Your entire life was structured around getting ready for the next thing, the next grade, the next job, the next step. You were taught to study hard so that you could pass the test so that you could get into college so that you could get a job so that you could earn a living so that eventually you could retire. And maybe if everything worked out, finally start living. But no one ever told you when that moment would actually begin, because it doesn't. It just keeps moving, just like the horizon. And that's the point Alan Watts was trying to make when he said, "You are under no obligation to be the person you were told to be, because the version of you that society shaped wasn't designed for presence. It was designed for performance. You weren't raised to feel your life. You were raised to delay it." The education system didn't teach you how to be still or how to listen to yourself. It taught you how to obey, how to compete, how to stay on track. The labor system didn't ask what made you feel alive. It asked what made you useful. And slowly, your mind adapted to this rhythm, one where the present was never enough and the future was always the goal. That's why so many people struggle in silence. According to Pew Research, the average American works 47 hours a week, but spends just 2 hours per week on what could be called true personal presence. 2 hours out of 168. That's not living, that's rehearsing. You were trained to postpone your life. And unless you unlearn that training, you'll keep waiting for the moment to begin, even when there's nothing left to wait for. So what does it mean to unlearn? It means recognizing that your worth is not tied to productivity, that you don't have to finish every task before you're allowed to feel peace. That joy doesn't have to be earned through exhaustion. It means letting go of the lie that life begins after the inbox is cleared, the bills are paid, the schedule is under control, because it doesn't. Life begins the moment you give yourself permission to feel it, even in the middle of the chaos. And here's the paradox. Those in-between moments you've been dismissing, the quiet coffee, the afternoon walk, the sound of your child's laughter, the pause between tasks, those were the real thing, not the distractions, not the filler, the point. To unlearn is not to reject responsibility. It's to reclaim rhythm, to stop waiting for a grand event and start living inside the small ones, the overlooked ones, the human ones. Because the tragedy isn't that life is short. The tragedy is that we spend so much of it preparing to live that we forget to actually do it. You've been told you need to wait, but maybe what you really need is to stop and remember, this moment right here isn't a stepping stone, it's the whole path. Once you begin unlearning the script, the one that told you to wait, to earn, to postpone, you start to realize something even deeper. The problem was never just the goal. The problem was the pace. You've spent your whole life being told to aim for a number, some financial target that promises peace once it's reached. Retirement accounts, income streams, investment strategies, all of it built around a single question: how much is enough? But maybe the better question is, enough for what kind of life? Because if you're chasing someone else's rhythm, someone else's speed, someone else's version of success, it doesn't matter how much you have. You'll always feel behind. Alan Watts said it best. The meaning of life is just to be alive. It is so plain and so obvious and so simple. And yet, everybody rushes around in a great panic as if it were necessary to achieve something beyond themselves. That panic is the rhythm you inherited, the clock you never questioned. But not everyone plays that game. There's a quiet rebellion happening beneath the surface. People choosing to downshift, to slow their lives, lower their costs, and reclaim their time. People who've realized that freedom isn't about having more, it's about needing less. They're not waiting until 65. They're designing lives they don't need to escape from. Movements like slow living, FIRE, financial independence, retire early, and intentional work-life design are growing. Not because people are lazy, but because they're exhausted. Exhausted from chasing a finish line that keeps moving. Exhausted from trading vitality for validation. And more importantly, they're discovering that a slower life can be a richer one. Because once you stop measuring your life by income or output, you make space for something else. Rhythm. Not the tempo of the economy, not the calendar of your boss, but your rhythm. The one that listens to your energy, your curiosity, your body, your soul. So no, You don't need a number, you need a rhythm. A rhythm that values presence over performance, depth over speed, stillness over stimulation. A rhythm that lets you spend more time being human and less time proving your worth. And no, it doesn't always look impressive on paper. It might mean earning less, consuming less, saying no more often. But in that space, something rare begins to grow: alignment. You begin to live a life that actually feels like yours, not one you're renting from someone else's expectations. Designing your rhythm isn't about quitting your job or fleeing society. It's about shifting the center of gravity in your life, from obligation to intention, from reacting to choosing, from survival to presence. And maybe, for the first time, you stop asking, "How much do I need to be free?" and start asking, "How do I want to feel while I'm alive?" Because in the end, it's not about retiring from the world. It's about retiring from the rhythm that never belonged to you, the one that made you rush past yourself in pursuit of something you didn't even choose. You don't need to retire to feel free. You need to stop outsourcing your rhythm to a world that never learned how to breathe. Because when you reclaim your rhythm, you reclaim your time, your truth, your life. But even after you reclaim your rhythm, even after you stop chasing the number, there's something deeper you'll have to face. A quieter force, one that's shaped your thoughts, your fears, your decisions. It's the script, not the spreadsheet, not the bank account. The invisible story you were handed about what a good life should look like. A story written by people who never asked what truly matters to you. A story so deeply embedded, most people mistake it for truth. Alan Watts warned us, the desire for security and the feeling of insecurity are the same thing. You think you're playing it safe, sticking to the plan, following the rules, but what you're really doing is performing a role you didn't choose, to earn approval you never needed. You're not afraid because you lack money. You're afraid because your identity is tangled in expectations, in roles, in reputations, in a need to be seen as responsible, respectable, stable, even when it costs you your soul. According to a 2022 study from the American Psychological Association, the number one cause of burnout in high-functioning adults wasn't workload. It was the feeling of being trapped in responsibility, trapped in being the provider, the achiever, the adult who never breaks character. You weren't told to find yourself. You were told to become someone people could admire, someone they wouldn't criticize, someone who looked like success, even if they felt like a ghost. And this is what no one tells you about retirement, that most people don't actually retire from a job. They retire from a persona, from the pressure to keep showing up as someone they never really were. The respectability trap is real. It's the invisible cage where people keep performing because they're terrified of being seen as lazy, lost, or less than. They don't keep going because they love the script. They keep going because the applause is addicting, because being admired feels safer than being real. But what's the cost of all that pretending? You forget how to feel. You forget what moves you. You confuse achievement with aliveness. And worst of all, you start believing that freedom is something you have to justify, that you need to hit a milestone before you're allowed to change, to rest, to say, "This isn't me anymore." But here's the truth. No number will ever free you from a script you're still afraid to question. The most radical act of freedom is not quitting your job. It's retiring from the character you've been forced to play. It's the decision to stop performing a version of yourself that was built to make others comfortable. It's saying, "I don't need to prove my worth through busyness. I don't need to meet every expectation placed on me. I don't need to chase a finish line that was never mine. Because I'm not here to impress the world. I'm here to inhabit my life." And that's the shift the system never prepared you for. It taught you how to work, how to earn, how to survive. But it never taught you how to be, how to feel without performing, how to exist without a title, how to live without explaining yourself. That's why so many people reach retirement and collapse, not from fatigue, but from the emotional whiplash of shedding a self they've carried for 40 years. So maybe the question isn't, do I have enough saved? Maybe the question is, am I ready to stop performing? Because the greatest prison was never financial. It was psychological. It was the inherited belief that you had to become something more before you were allowed to be yourself. But Alan Watts reminds us, freedom isn't earned through obedience. It's remembered through awareness. You were always free to walk off the stage. You just didn't know the performance was optional. So what happens next, once you step off the stage? Once you let go of the persona, the performance, the relentless chase for enough? That's where the real journey begins. Not the journey toward a destination, but the journey back to yourself. Because the truth is, you were never lacking. You were just buried under roles, responsibilities, and 1,000 silent agreements about who you're supposed to be. Alan Watts didn't promise you clarity or comfort. He didn't hand out formulas or 5-step plans. What he offered was far more dangerous: permission. Permission to live without pretending, to stop measuring your life by other people's timelines, to stop delaying joy in the name of appearing responsible, to stop outsourcing your freedom to a system that was never designed with your aliveness in mind. So the next time you catch yourself asking, how much money do I need to retire? Pause, take a breath, and ask the question underneath it. How much of my life have I already postponed? Because maybe the answer you're looking for isn't at the end of a compound interest chart. Maybe it's right here, in the decision to stop waiting for permission, in the courage to feel your life now, to reclaim your time, your rhythm, your voice. The retirement you're chasing may not come with a number. It might not be a date marked on a calendar. It might just begin the moment you stop performing and start paying attention. Because in the end, you don't need more money. You need fewer illusions. And the moment you see through them is the moment you begin to live.